Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the Managing Director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. A video like this is not something I initially set out to start making when we started making this channel, but facts sort of intervened during the pandemic, and it's kind of resulted in, I waded in on a lot of these topics that, especially where I thought a lot of public policy was not making any sense. And, I've kind of been on this ever since. So I guess the point I'm trying to make in the preface of this video is I sort of came by it honestly. I didn't really want to start making videos like this, but circumstances were such that I just felt, I think it's kind of necessary because I don't think people fully understand the context of what's going on when you hear people talk about, okay, we're going to revise the WHO's pandemic treaty. And revise, in my mind, is a massive understatement. I've done other videos before where I've said, at least in the American context, this isn't a revision. This isn't something where you're slightly tweaking terminology. Massive changes are going to be made to this, and in my opinion, that's not some fast-track process. That requires, in an American context, ratification by the U.S. Senate because it is a treaty and it fundamentally changes things. So I'm going to go over to a clip here real quick from Redacted. This is another channel here on YouTube, and they just do a heck of a job pointing out what's going on with this. Again, we've been talking about it for a while now, but they have the time and the resources to really do a deep dive into this, and I urge those who are watching this channel, go check out that video in detail if you want. Again, I'll put a link in the description below, but we'll go ahead and play a clip right here. And again, I'm going to go back into, at the beginning of this clip, this young lady who's speaking here is talking about the fact that all of the WHO treaty is going from a guidance nature to a legally binding. They say it over and over. She even highlights it in this clip I'm about to play. And again, I state again that I think, in my opinion, where you're taking something from being guidance to legally binding, at least in an American context, yeah, that requires a new treaty. That's not just you are changing a couple of things. It's like a regulatory thing or an administrative rule thing. No, the fundamental terms of this agreement are changing. That, in my mind, requires ratification under the Senate in the U.S. context. Now, in a Thailand context, obviously they do things differently here. Again, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I really think Thailand should reconsider this thing and not just sort of allow this to be promulgated without any further scrutiny. I think further scrutiny is highly warranted under the circumstances. Again, let me go ahead and play this clip. It's about a minute here. We're going to go ahead and play that and we'll come back to you.
From the draft that was released earlier this year, it says that, I just highlighted the word binding, how many times, that this draft was written with the intention of putting in place binding and some non-binding, legally binding elements. And what binding powers do they want? Well, they haven't exactly told us yet because this is still in draft. Here is from the draft that was released this February saying they want control of all of these things, such as to define what things are a pathogen or has pandemic potential. They want to define a One Health approach and also One Health surveillance. The things that are circled here in red are the things that I just found the scariest. You can highlight other things if you want. Infodemic, interpandemic, and also they want to define recovery. So they decide when it's over, when it's done.
So as you can see in the clip of this video, one of the big things to my mind is, again, the fact that this goes from recommendations and guidance to binding, legally binding. Again, I don't see why that's necessary, and quite honestly, after we saw what happened, throughout this decade of the 2020s, got to be honest with you, I'm not so sure I want WHO guidance to become binding in any way. I don't want some supranational organization to be making rulings that bind me here in Thailand or bind Thailand to have to do anything. Quite honestly, I think Thailand's pretty capable of figuring out how to do what she needs to do on her own. And, so that's just sort of my basic thinking on that. Again, I reiterate, in an American context, at the very least, if this is going to be passed into law, it needs to be ratified by the Senate. That's just clear to me. this is such a fundamental change. You can't claim this is something cosmetic. And even then, where is there a cosmetic exception to ratification under U.S. constitutional procedure? I've never seen that. That said, I know in the past where, again, regulations and administrative rulings springing from treaties changing, yes, you could argue that that's a different process than full re-ratification of a new treaty, but this is new. This is fundamentally, qualitatively changing the terms of the treaty. Now, going back into that clip, I wanted to go ahead and point out a few things, which is also pursuant to the WHO, this new iteration, this WHO pandemic treaty, they want to go ahead and have the ability to define a bunch of terms. For example, the term, quote, pathogen and pandemic potential, unquote, means they want to define the meaning of that. Quote, One Health approach, unquote, want to define that. One Health surveillance. And again, I'm not going to go into the details in the high weeds on this. Frankly, I think it's kind of beyond the bailiwick of the channel, and I like to do shorter videos on here. Again, go check out Redacted. She goes through all the, they both do, go through all the analysis of what this One Health surveillance is. Quoting further, infodemic. They want to define that term, infodemic. So now they're making up words, okay? Hey, I had a law professor, really good guy. He was kind of an old curmudgeon, but he said something to me that was very wise. He said, when lawyers are making up words, Annie, get your gun, sort of thing. Like it's pretty, you're in the high weeds when they're making up words, okay? And maybe I shouldn't have said it like that, but that was literally his quote in law school. He said, hey, things are changing. You need to take, and his point with that is not to advocate any kind of violence or anything like that. But his point is, you need to take notice. You need to look at what is happening. When they come up with a word like infodemic, every time I saw that word and when I was watching that video, I kept thinking of, I believe it was when RFK was called before Congress and he was giving congressional testimony and he was talking about malinformation, the definition of malinformation. So they had misinformation, disinformation, which have a qualitatively, how do we put this? You can hang your hat on something with those words. Misinformation, it may not be intentionally conveyed, but it's incorrect. Disinformation, presumably, is incorrect information which is intentionally and sometimes maliciously conveyed. But as Mr. Kennedy pointed out, malinformation was just information that they don't want you to talk about. Whether it's, even though it's right, it's malinformation. And he brought that up to me. And so when I saw this infodemic, what is that? That to my mind is pretty, that's something to worry about. And then another term, interpandemic. So a pandemic within a I don't even know what that is. Interpandemic. Current health expenditure, universal health coverage. They want to define that as well. And then finally, and this was the one I thought was most pernicious, especially having come off of 3 years of what I can only describe as economic and social hell of going through all this stuff. But recovery. They want to define recovery. Now, again, the power to, this is sort of one of the first things you learn when you are trained in law, is the power to define is the power to control. So if they can, and that was sort of the interesting thing watching this pandemic, especially the response. As I've said before, I'm not going to get into some crazy notions that this wasn't a real thing or that something real wasn't happening, but I think we can now all agree the information is in. This was an exaggeration on orders of magnitude above anything we've ever seen before. And I don't know if it's kind of one of those afraid of your own shadows sort of things. I want to believe everybody operated in good faith. I really do. But especially after seeing some of the things coming out in the United States with regard to documentation on how all this is played out, it causes me to question. That said, not the point of this video, and I don't want to get off on that. But one thing I noticed was, look, the recovery kind of happened on its own. People just got better. As they said, I'm not going to get into the whole herd immunity and all of that, but the virus ran its course, as it were, and we got on with our lives. My question is, why would a supranational organization, which has proven to this point to over-exaggerate things and bring in guidance which results in severe curtailing of the overall economy, severe curtailing of basic human rights, severe curtailing of basic societal functions, why would we want that organization to necessarily get to define when that state of affairs comes to an end? I don't really like that. I would just kind of rather if recovery, again, remains self-evident. I have noticed the past 3 years there has been, in many different arenas, a massive push to try to semantically nitpick notions that are self-evident, things that we just used to take for granted. I've had multiple people tell me personally, they've said, yeah, these are things our grandparents just knew off the top of their head. And again, the notion of recovery. I think we all know when we've recovered from an illness. We don't need a supranational bureaucracy to tell us when we're better. Again, reasonable people may be able to disagree on these things, but at the end of the day, this is a major change. It will result in fundamental changes to certain laws, to certain abilities to exercise one's liberty. So it's not something that I think we should dismiss out of hand. It's definitely something we should scrutinize and take a minute before making any final decision, which could have a massive fundamental impact in the long term.